Good morning, everybody. Welcome to another ePrime livestream. My name is Devon Struthers. I'm the training coordinator for Psychology Software Tools, and today's task is going to be about Cross Modal Priming. Now, this was actually requested by one of our YouTube followers, so thank you very much for requesting this. If you guys have any other experimental paradigms that you'd like to see, please let me know. I'm always happy to take a look at them and do them live for everybody. So, Cross Modal Priming is actually pretty cool. I looked it up. So what this is we're actually going to present two types of stimuli to participants. The standard for this is, generally speaking, there's a light, either a bright light or a dim light that is paired with a sound, either a loud sound or a soft sound, and participants will have to respond to the light, but the distracting part of it is going to be the sound object that actually doesn't really have any bearing on the response to the light that they're doing, but it does do a good job of distracting participants. And it's all about your attention and about how you're splitting your attention. So I actually really like this one, and I saw a lot of really cool studies that compared it to, like, for example, talking on the cell phone while you're driving or those types of things. So it's a really cool task, and I'm really excited about it today. So let's go ahead and jump right in. So what I have here is just a blank version of eStudio. This is, just what happens when you open up eStudio 3.0. And today we're going to start from a blank template right here. So to start from a blank template, you can either click on the word blank and it'll open up a blank template, but it takes a little while to load it. But if you notice behind it, there's already a blank template already loaded. So if you just click on cancel, it's kind of a little shortcut to get to the blank template. So what I'm going to do is I'm actually first going to start with the entirety of our session proc. Now the session proc represents our experiment from beginning to end. So what am I going to, what are the first things the participants are going to see and what's the last thing they're going to see? So what I'm going to do is I'm going to first take a text display object from my toolbox here, and I'm going to drag it and drop it as the first object in my timeline. And you can tell it's the first object because it's the closest to this little green circle here. And we're going to go ahead and rename this object just by clicking on it and clicking F2. Like I always say, I want the name to reflect the function of the object. So I'm going to rename this one just to welcome. Now what this welcome text display object is going to do is it's actually going to show us or tell participants, first, welcome to the task, just a really nice message. And then it's also going to do a good job of saying, hey, here's what we're going to be doing in the task, and then introducing a practice, because in this task we're going to have some practice trials and we're going to have some critical trials, and it's actually going to be pretty quick and easy to make, and I'll show you that. So let's go ahead and double click on the text display object to edit some of its properties. So if you notice, you click on it, you see the welcome screen as a tab at the top here, and I can cycle through my tabs just by clicking on them, but you can see it open in the workspace. And text display objects look pretty uninteresting when you show them like this. They're just a big blank field with a cursor in the top middle of it. So I'm going to just go ahead and start typing. So just welcome to the experiment. So if you notice, this actually shows up in the top center of the screen, but if I click on my properties page here and take a look at this align horizontal and align vertical property, you'll notice that they both say center. So despite this being in the very top center of this object, since my align vertical property is set to center, this is actually going to show up in the dead middle of the screen whenever I run the task. So I'm just keeping that in mind while I edit these objects. So welcome to the experiment. Let's go ahead and type a little bit more. So in this task, you will be asked to respond to images. If you see, you see a green image, press 1 on the keyboard. If you see a red image, press 2 on the keyboard. Now I'm doing this, and I'm doing these images, and I'm also doing these types of sounds just because they're very good placeholders. So if you guys have different images that you'll be using in your tasks, you can actually just swap out my images for yours, and all you'll have to do is just change the file name. And the same thing with the sounds. All you have to do is swap out the sound file names for the ones that you guys want, and then you'll have the same version or your version of the same task. So now after I have my green images and red image text, I'll say you will also be hearing a tone along with the presentation of the images. A high pitch tone is most likely to be paired with a green image. A low pitch tone, is most likely be paired with a red image. Oh, and I made that plural. A green images doesn't make any sense. There we go. And then press space to begin a short practice. There we go. So I now have all of my components here. I have the task itself. So you're going to see a green image and a red image. Press 1 for the green image, press 2 for the red image. You're also going to be hearing a tone. And then here's where that priming part, because this is, cross modal priming. They have a high pitch tone and a low pitch tone. I spelled low like Rob Lowe and not like the actual low that I mean. So I'm going to go ahead and get rid of that E at the end of there. That was not intentional. So you have a high pitch tone and a low pitch tone. The high pitch is most likely to be paired with a green image. The low pitch is most likely to be paired with that red image. That's my priming. So now I said press space to begin a short practice. Like every instruction screen that anyone who's ever watched these ever watches me make, I'm actually going to go ahead and click on the properties page and go onto that duration input tab. Now, like I say almost every video, I like this to stay on the screen for as long as participants need to thoroughly understand the instructions given to them, because I do have the keyboard mapping on this. So participants will have to find the 1 and 2 key on the keyboard and know that, okay, left, or the 1 button, which is on the left side, is going to be the green image, and the red image, the 2, which is on the right side, is the red image. They have to do all that in their head during this. So I like this to stay up on screen as long as they need. So I'm going to change that duration from 1000 to infinite. I'm going to change my data logging to standard. And I'm going to go ahead and add a keyboard input mask. And I'm just going to change my allowable from any to space. Go ahead and click apply and OK to save that. Now before I click OK to get out of this menu, I do want to show you what standard logging does, because it's really easy to say, yeah, standard logging, and kind of move on. But if you click on this logging tab, you can see everything that it logs. So standard logging includes these time audit properties as well as these dependent measures. So if you choose time audit only, it's obviously only going to show you this time audit section, and that's all you're going to log. And we're going to log those a couple of times, just the time audit properties. But the dependent measures also have to do with the response. So if you choose response only, you're only going to get these. Now personally, I like both sets of data. It tells me how long it was on the screen. It tells me if there are any errors with it coming on screen, if there's any delays associated with that. But most importantly, then it tells me what they responded, how they responded, and was that response accurate. Now, of course, for this, every response is going to be accurate. I only enabled the keyboard, or only enabled the space bar and the keyboard. That's the only thing participants can press. So every response is a correct response. It's like the best casino game ever, but this is just how I want to log it. I want to see how long they read it, and that's going to show up in my RT value. So RT is how long from when this object appeared on the screen to when they pressed the space bar, or how many milliseconds passed between when it showed up on screen to when they pressed the space bar. So that's going to be really helpful for me. So I'm going to go ahead and click OK. So that's all the changes I need to do to this welcome object. So then the next thing that I want to do is I want to add a list object. This list object is actually going to control all of the the flow of my experiment. It's going to decide where the practice trials show up and where the critical trials show up. So to do that, I'm going to take a list object from my toolbox and put it just after welcome. I'm going to go ahead and rename my list1 object to block list. So now that I know that this is what's going to control my blocks of trials in ePrime. Now in ePrime we call a block of trials just different trial types, and in this we have 2 trial types. We have practice trials and we have critical trials. So that's why it's called block list, is because there'll be 2 blocks in my experiment and they'll be manipulated this way. So let's go ahead and double click on the block list, and the only thing I'm going to do here is I'm first just going to make my critical trials, because honestly all of my practice trials are just going to be the same thing as my critical trials. There'll just be fewer of them, and I'm not going to show them all of the images, just probably 1 or 2. So for my procedure, I'm just going to put block proc, and we're going to hit enter. Now you get this prompt. It says procedure does not exist. Would you like to create it? Of course I would. And then it says, would you like to make this procedure the default value for newly created levels? I'm going to click no, because I am going to be adding new and different types of procedures to this. There we go. So now that I have my block proc here, I am going to add things to this eventually, and that's once my experiment structure is all kind of fleshed out. But what I want to do now is I just want to add another list object. And for those of you who are kind of new to ePrime, I know this process looks a little silly of just adding all of these list objects, but it is going to make sense. I promise we will just get there. So for this list1 object, this is where all of my independent variables are going to live. So this is where all of the images that I want to present to users are going to be held. These are where all of the sounds that I'm going to present to users are going to live. And this is where whether or not each trial is a correct or incorrect answer is also going to be. So the first thing I want to do is I want to add a new procedure here, and this is just going to be called trial list. Now, all I need to do to add that is just type the word trial list into the procedure column, hit enter. Doesn't exist. Would I like to create it? Of course I would. Would I like to make the default value for newly created levels? I'm going to click yes. Now, I kind of did something a little out of order and something that wasn't necessarily great ePrime practice. I didn't rename my list1 object. I kind of kept it in list1. Again, like I always say, it's best to rename objects to match their purpose. So I'm going to rename this list object here from list1 to trial list. Whoops. So again, I'm going to go into here. I'm going to rename this procedure from trial list just to Trialproc. So it's actually a procedure. There we go. And this list object is going to be called trial list. There we go. Sometimes I get those names a little messed up or a little backwards. So I'm just deleting that trial list from unreferenced, renaming this one to trial list because it's a list object, and there we go. So now that we have our Trialproc here, I'm going to go ahead and add a few more levels to this. I'm going to add, I think, have a total of 20 levels, and I'll show you why I think I'll have 20 levels in a second. So I'm going to go ahead and add 18 levels to this just so I have 20 in total. And then I'm going to add a procedure. Now I'm going to add an attribute. So the attribute that I'm going to add is going to be specifically to hold the images that I'm going to show to participants. So in this case, it's going to be called stim image. Now, if I look at these prepared images that I have into this Cross Modal Priming, I have two folders here, and I'm going to save my ePrime experiment into the same folder so it's easy to reference these. But I have one called the images and one called the sounds. If I click on my sounds, I just have two sounds, high pitch and low pitch. And these two are just audio load reports that ePrime automatically generates. They're not actually sound files. But if you look here, they're just high pitch and they are a WAV file. You hold your little cursor over that, you can see it says WAV file. And same for low pitch. I actually just made these this morning in Audacity. And then the images are just red and green shapes, and they're going to be different shapes, different sizes, those types of things. But the important part is that they are red shapes and are green shapes. So these are the images that we're going to load into the experiment. And then again, if I hover my mouse over top of one of them here, you can see that it's going to be a JPEG image. And if we go to properties, you can also see that. If you're ever wondering what kind of file do I have, you just look at this type of file property, and you can see .jpeg. So that's how I have to reference this file. So whenever I'm loading into ePrime, I know that I have to reference green1.jpg. Go ahead and click OK. And if you notice, I named them pretty easy here. Just green 1, green 2, 3, 4, 5, and then red 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So let's go ahead and reference those images. So I'll put green1.jpg, green2.jpg, and all the way up to 5. Oops. I have two green 3s in there, so let's go ahead and change that to green 5. It's always important to keep in mind, or not 5, sorry, green 4. It's always important to keep in mind whenever you're editing that you get these image names exactly correct. And even correct to the point where if I type .jpg there and I hit a space after my file name, ePrime is actually going to not be able to find that file because it's also looking for that space after the file name. So it's important that you get these image names exactly correct. So now we'll do my red ones. Those are much easier. So now what I'm going to do is I'm going to actually repeat these again. So I'm going to have my greens and my reds one more time. Now instead of typing all of those out, because I know that wasn't particularly exciting to watch, what I'm going to do is select the first one here and then drag my mouse all the way down so I can select all of them. And on the keyboard, I'm going to hit Control-C. Then I'm going to select the very first item, the very first blank row, so it's going to be row 11, and hit Control-V to paste, and then it's just going to paste these. Now, the reason that I'm doing this instead of having all of my weights set to 2 is because I want to vary what sound object is going to be played or what sound is going to be played along with that image. So that way I have instances where my green images are paired with the high-pitched sound, so that's going to be a congruent condition. And then I have instances where my green images are going to be paired with a low-pitched sound or an incongruent condition. And of course, I'm going to change the probability of each one of them appearing, and we'll do that later as well. Now, while I was doing that, you'll notice something that I do end up seeing a lot in support, and that's this recursive loop right here. When ePrime runs into this, ePrime is actually going to crash the experiment. So we do recommend being, on the lookout for these types of recursive loops. Now, what a recursive loop means is it means that ePrime is actually going to take a look at your procedure object, and the procedure object is referencing itself, basically. And you'll notice that because in my procedure column, I have one column of Trialproc, and the rest default to that trial list that I had mistakenly typed earlier. So what it's trying to do is it's now trying to reference itself. So it's now saying that the procedure is the same as this list object. And ePrime is basically going to sit in that loop and spin and spin and spin and never be able to move on because it's trying to reference itself, and it gets ePrime very confused. So to fix it, it's incredibly easy. All you have to do is just make sure that I'm referencing this Trialproc instead of my trial list. And I can get this exact same recursive loop for a number of reasons. So what I'm going to do is take this little fill handle here on Trialproc and just drag and drop. And if you notice, once these all say Trialproc, my recursive loop goes away. Now keep in mind that you can also get this recursive loop by referencing the same procedure object that it's currently on. So if you notice, my trial list is sitting nicely on my block proc. However, if I type block proc there, you'll see that that nasty recursive loop shows up one more time. That means that ePrime's trying to make a procedure that it's already on. So again, you get that loop. So to change it, just make sure you have Trialproc in here. Like I said, we do end up seeing that quite a lot in ePrime. So definitely, be on the lookout for things like that, especially in your structure here. If you see the word recursive loop, that'll crash your experiment 100% of the time. So now that we have all of our images, let's go ahead and look at our sounds. So if we go to our folder called the sounds, I just have high pitch and low pitch. So I'm going to go ahead and add one more attribute. This will be called stim sound. High pitch dot wave. Now my high pitch in this case are going to apply to my congruent conditions for my green, and then for my incongruent conditions, I'm just going to copy these and put them on red. Because red image paired with a high pitch sound is going to be an incongruent condition. A green image paired with a high pitch sound is a congruent condition. And then we have low pitch dot wave. Now our low pitch sound with red is of course going to be a congruent condition. So let's go ahead and copy and paste here. And then paired with a green condition is going, or a green image is going to be an incongruent condition. So that's why I had 20 of these instead of just 10 for each one of these green images. I want to be able to pair these with each one of these images. Now what I can do is I can actually put my, my stim sound in a nested list and only have these 10 rows. But what I have to do then afterwards is I have to use an inline object in order to determine what the congruency of each trial was. So if you take a look at our priming video, I actually do that in the priming video as well. So this is just another way to kind of go about that. The priming video that we have isn't cross-modal like this. It's actually just a standard priming task. All right, so I have my stim sound. So the next one I'm going to do is I'm going to make an attribute that's not going to be actually used right now. It's not going to be used to manipulate anything, but it'll be really helpful in our data analysis later. And this one's just going to be called congruency. Enter. So congruency is just going to let me know if this is a congruent trial or an incongruent trial. So obviously these first few are going to be congruent. So whenever green is paired with a high pitch, and whenever red is paired with a low pitch, that is going to be our congruent trial. And if you notice, I just split these literally in half. And then I have incongruent when green is paired with a low pitch, and it's also incongruent when red is paired with a high pitch. So now that I have all of those, there is one more attribute I need to make, and that's going to be my correct response. Because if you remember, participants are only responding to this image on the screen. So they're only responding to whether or not a green or a red image appeared. The fact that it's a congruent or incongruent trial only has to do with priming. So I'm going to go ahead and click on the Add Attribute button, and I'm going to just type correct answer and hit enter. So the correct answer for a green image is going to be a 1. Let's do that the hard way. And then the correct answer for a red image is 2. And then if you notice, I have my green and my red in exactly the same formation, so all I have to do is highlight my correct answer column, click Control-C, and then Control-V, and then I have my correct answer. Sometimes I like to see the correct answer immediately next to the object that dictates whether the answer was correct. So instead of having correct answer all the way to the right here, if you want to move it next to stim image, you can take it, highlight it just by clicking this little down arrow on the attribute name, holding your mouse button in and just moving it to the left. And this little red line that appears there is actually going to show you where it's going to appear on the slide object. So if I put it here, it's going to show between stim image and stim sound. So I'll do that just to kind of pair these two things together to make sure that they're exactly in line with each other. Now that's really all I need to do in this object. So the next thing I need to do is I need to change this sequential selection, because right now it's just set to run through all of the greens and all of the reds and all the greens and all the reds. And that's not necessarily ideal. At some point, participants are going to go, okay, I'm only seeing the greens and reds, I get it. So we're going to go to the properties page and click on the selection tab. Now, unlike last week where we selected random with replacement, and if you're ever wondering about that or why I would choose that, definitely watch that video. It's a really good one. I'm going to choose random. So this random order is actually going to select one of these from my possible list of trials, and then it will take it off so it won't be randomly shown again. So for example, if it shows green 2, it's not going to show green 2 again unless it's green 2 in an incongruent condition. Then I'm going to go to my reset exit tab, and then instead of only running 20 samples, I don't think that's enough. I'm going to go ahead and cycle this 5 times, so they're going to get 100 samples. And that number of samples is going to grow in just a second, because I'm going to make one more change to this object. But for now, I'm going to click Apply and OK. Now, let's take a look at our instructions quickly again. So I'm going to hop back over there. We're not editing the instructions, so if you're following along, you don't have to hop over with me. But I'm going to go ahead and click on the Welcome screen. Now it says, a high-pitched tone is most likely to be paired with the green image. A low-pitched tone is most likely to be paired with the red image. Now, if I look at my trial list, that's not at all how my experiment's set up. Right now, my green images and a high-pitched tone are just as likely as a green image and a low-pitched tone. And I can change that very, very easily. All I have to do is edit this weight property for all of the congruent trials because, you know, they're more likely to happen, so I need more of those to appear. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to change my weight of each one of these congruent conditions from 1 to 2. And doing that is going to mean that E' is going to choose that particular exemplar twice instead of just once. So now it is literally 2 times as likely to appear than these incongruent conditions. So that way, you know, my instructions didn't make me a liar. They are actually more likely to appear. And if you notice, whenever I did that, it actually ups the number of trials I have. So I now went from 100 to 150 because I literally doubled all of these. So that looks really good to me. That's all the changes that I need to make to this list object. So let's go ahead and actually get into the meat of what we're going to be seeing. So I'm going to close out of these windows just by clicking Window and clicking Close All. And I'm going to hop into my Trialproc here. Now, the first thing that I want to do in this procedure is I want to show participants a fixation cross. So I'm going to drag a text display object from my toolbox onto the very beginning of my Trialproc here. And I'm going to rename this one just to Fixation. And I'm going to add a fixation plus just by clicking on the plus button. Again, since my align horizontal and align vertical properties are both set to center, this is going to show up in the dead center of the screen, despite the fact that it looks like it's at the very top here. Go over to my duration input tab, and I'm going to set my duration from its default value to 500 milliseconds, just because I want this to show up quickly. I'm going to change my data logging to time audit only, and I'm not going to add any input masks to this. I just want it to show up on the screen very quickly and then leave. Go ahead and click Apply and OK. And then on my Trialproc, I want to add one more object. This is what's going to be used to display the sound in the video. Or sorry, the sound in the image. So I'm going to take my my slide object and drag it just after my fixation object. Kind of gave away what I was going to call it there. It's actually going to be called stimulus. So all I need to do is rename this object from slide 1 to stimulus and hit enter. Double click on it to open it in the workspace here. Now if you notice, I have 2 types of stimuli I'm going to show. That's kind of the cross modal part of this. So I'm going to show an image followed by a sound. And by followed by, I mean at exactly the same time. So to load my image, I'm going to click on slide image and then put it anywhere on the slide because I'm going to edit its properties anyway, but I always like to try to hit close to the center there. I'm going to click on the properties page icon right here. And then the first thing I need to do is load in my image. Now, if you remember right, I have this attribute here, and I'll hop over to my attributes tab to make sure that I have these absolutely correct. But I have that attribute that I had made on my list object called stim image. So I'll need to load my stim image. So to make an attribute reference for stim image, you type stim image in square brackets. Now, before I go ahead and call it a day, though, let's take a look at my folder structure. So first off, I have the images and the sounds, and I haven't actually saved my experiment, so let's do that quickly. So I'm going to go ahead and click cancel there quick, and I'm going to save my experiment, and I'm actually going to choose to put it right here, right in the same directory as these two, the sounds and the images subfolders. Let's call this one Cross Modal Priming. There we go. So now if we take a look at this, here's my EEPROM experiment I'm currently working on, and then in subfolders along with it, I have the images and the sounds. So if I hop back to my image file name here, I can load my images just by clicking on the images and then clicking on one. And if I do that, what happens is it fills in the images with a / and then the image I'm loading. Now I want to keep the the images with a / because that's what's telling EEPROM, hey, look in a subfolder to find this image. So I want that, but I'm going to delete the direct reference to green1.jpg. And instead of that, I'm actually just going to put that stim image attribute reference that we had made a little earlier. So what this is going to do is then fill it in with either green 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 or red 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5, and they'll all have .jpg at the end of them because that's how we put it in our list object. So go ahead and click apply. And as you can see here, this little symbol that we have here now turned purple instead of gray, which means that it's going to be looking for an attribute. And I'm going to change the stretch property from no to yes. And the reason I'm changing that to yes is because I only want this to take up the size of the field that I give it. The images that I'm loading are pretty big, so there might be a chance that some of them are kind of cut off, either left or right or up and down. They might be cut off. So I don't necessarily need to, or I don't necessarily want to load in the native size of the image. And then what I'm going to do is hop over to this frame tab. Oh, I was so close. I want my X and Y to be center and center. I was at 48%. So to make it center and center, I could either put 50% or I could just do center. And if I click apply, you can see that it moved to the very middle of the screen. And I want my height and width to be 50% of the screen, just because it's a relatively large image. I want it to be kind of the main feature of the screen. So now that I have my image loaded, the other thing that I need is to actually load my sound. And loading sound in an EEPROM experiment is extremely similar to loading images. We make it really easy, and we make loading all of these external files extremely quick. So all you have to do is click on this slide sound out button on the left-hand side of the screen, and then put it anywhere on this slide. So now the image presentation and the sound presentation are going to happen at exactly the same time. Now, since the sound out object doesn't necessarily have a visual component, this slide sound out object can be literally anywhere on the screen, and it does not matter. So I'll put it over here, I can put it down here, I can put it right over top of this slide image sub object. It doesn't matter. I'm going to click on the properties page icon in the top left there. So here's my sound out. Now to load a sound out, it's just going to be extremely similar to loading my images. I want to reference my subfolder that I have my sound files in. In this case, it's going to be called the sounds. So I have the sounds, and then a /, or if I want, I can have 2 backslashes. That's also acceptable. But I'll do a / there, and then I will just make a simple attribute reference to my stim sound attribute and close it off. And that's all I need to do. I want to keep my buffer mode to streaming. That's an important tip in EEPROM 3. We do recommend only keeping that buffered mode to streaming if you're going to be loading in multiple sounds. Buffer size we can keep at its minimum there. We don't want it to loop. We do want it to stop when the slide's done, and we don't want it to do anything weird once it finishes playing. We do have the option to have it terminate the slide object when the sound's done playing, but we also want participants to be responding on this slide as well. So we don't want anything to happen once the sound object's done. So we can go ahead and click apply and OK. And if you notice here, our little sound out symbol turned green, which means that, hey, you did load a sound file into here. So let's go ahead and hop into the properties page to change some of the properties of this object. We're going to keep all of these properties the same. So the state, we only have one slide state. Display name, it can be blank. We only have one display as well. And then the input source. These are more important once we start to get into slide buttons and slide sliders and stuff like that. And definitely check out those videos. I made separate videos on the slide buttons and slide sliders, and I do really go into depth about what that property does. But for now, we'll go to Duration Input tab here, and I'm going to change my duration to infinite because I want this to be on screen for as long as participants need to respond to it. I'm going to change my data logging to standard. I already went over what that did. And I'm going to add a keyboard input mask. Now, for now, what I'm going to do is I'm going to change my allowable from any to either 1 or 2 on the keyboard. So all you do to add multiple keys is just type them next to each other. So in this case, I just want 1, 2. Those are the only keyboard responses that I think participants should be able to make. I don't want them to accidentally push 3 or, the space bar or anything like that. and I'm going to change my correct here to that correct answer. I'm sorry. There you go, correct answer attribute that I had made earlier. So then correct answer is going to fill in with either 1 or 2 depending on the trial. The time limit property I want to keep as same as duration, and my end action is of course going to be terminate, because once participant responds I don't see the need to have this up on screen anymore. So I'm going to go ahead and click apply and OK to save those changes. And that's all I need to do to that stimulus object. So now I have the visual and audio components of this experiment running exactly the same time. And then I just need to add one more item to my procedure here, and I'm going to call this one ITI. It's going to stand for intertrial interval, and I'm just going to add this at the very end. So I'm going to go ahead and add it and rename it, call it ITI, and hit enter. Double click on it to open it in the workspace here, and I'm just going to keep it completely blank. And my ITI in this case is going to be 500 milliseconds as well. So I'll just change that duration to 500, change my data logging to time audit only, and click apply and OK, and I am good to go. Apply takes a little while. There we go. All right. So now that I have my Trialproc already done, and I have all of my images loaded, and I have all of my cross-section here, what I need to do is need to add some practice trials. Now, I'd mentioned I was going to do that a little later, and let's close all of these first just to clear this. What I want to do is I want to add it to my block list. Now, the reason I'm adding practice trials to my block list, and I'm not just adding practice trials to this list, is because these are set to random. So if I add more practice trials to this list, what it's going to do is it's going to intersperse practice trials with critical trials, and that's not really how practice works. But if I go into my block list here and I add another level here, and just call this blank level prac block proc, which is a bit of a tongue twister, what it's going to do is it's going to add my practice block proc. Now, if you notice, my practice block proc is actually happening after my critical proc, which is the worst practice ever. So to change the order of these procedures, what I could do is delete one and type one, and delete the other and type the other. Or I could take this ID, just click on that little arrow so it highlights the entire row, and then hold down my mouse button, and then just like moving around an attribute, I can see exactly where this is going to go by that little red line. If I move that to the little red line at the very top, you can see that my prac block proc is actually going to show up at the very top as the first procedure. And then if I click into my Experiment Explorer and click F5 in order to refresh it, you're going to see that my prac block proc now jumps to the top, so my practice is in fact before my critical trials, which is exactly what I want. So for this, what I want to do is I want to make a list object that's extremely similar to this trial list. Now what I could do is I could bore you guys by making this again, or I could actually just copy and paste this trial list object. So if I copy it by right-clicking and clicking copy, and then going into my prac block proc and right-clicking and clicking paste, it says the object you are pasting contains child objects, and in this case child objects are all of these E objects that are beneath my trial list. It says, would you like to paste all of the child objects in addition to the primary object? I'm going to go ahead and click no, because what it does when it pastes the new one, or if I were to click yes, what it would do is it would actually add entire new instances of fixation, stimulus, and ITI, and I am not changing the practice that much that these need to be their own objects. So what I do is if I click no, it's actually just going to reference Trialproc, fixation, stimulus, and ITI from my main block proc. So if I click on it, you see fixation highlighted here, but you also see it in bold down there. That means any change that I make to this fixation object, if I go ahead and change that to, let's say, a question mark instead of a plus sign, and I close out of these windows and then open it in my trial list, it's still that plus sign because it's the exact same object just referenced twice, which is honestly exactly what I want. So I'm going to go into my trial list one, and I'm actually going to rename this one just to prac trial list. Now, if you notice, since that was trial list one and this one's trial list, any changes I make to this list object aren't going to affect my trial list down here. They're just going to affect themselves, or it's just going to affect like this list object in and of itself. So what I want to do is I want to change my weights back to 1 for all of these, because we don't need the same kind of, one-to-one, or the same kind of distribution of stimuli or congruent or incongruent trials for the practice. But what I am going to do is I'm going to make it so I only show the one version of each one of these images, because I do want the practice to not be the entire task, or it's going to be extremely boring and they're going to know the task by then. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to actually highlight these. So I'm highlighting green 2 to green 5, and I'm clicking on remove levels, and then ask me if I'm sure, and of course I'm sure. I'm going to do the same thing with red 2 to red 5. for the congruent conditions. Now we do the same thing for green 2 to 5 for the incongruent conditions, and the same thing for red 2 to 5 for the incongruent conditions as well. So now I just have the very most basic cross-section of my exemplars. I have green 1, red 1 twice with a high-pitched or low-pitched sound, so both congruent and incongruent. That way participants are used to hearing the high-pitched sound, hearing the low-pitched sound, so once they get into the critical trials, they can then easily identify what's the high pitch and what's the low pitch, and then they have an idea of what the green and red images are going to look like, or the kind of images that they will be. So it's a good enough practice. But if I look here, you notice it still says 20 samples, which is an incredibly big practice. So I'm going to head and change my properties here. I'm going to go to Reset Exit. Now I'm just going to exit this after 2 cycles. So participants will see each one of these exemplars twice. That way, it's a little more solidified in their head exactly what they're getting into. Now, the one thing I do want to add to my experiment, and this is going to look a little tricky at first, but the one thing I want to add to my practice trials is I want to let them know if they're responding correctly or incorrectly. That way they have that feedback and they have that idea that, okay, I am responding correctly or not. Now, I only want my feedback in my practice trials and not my critical trials. So if I double click on Trialproc on the practice trials and add a feedback object, you're going to see that it appears now in both my practice and critical, and that's not ideal. So what I have to do is I want to first get rid of that. I'll come back to that later. It's in unreferenced. I can definitely grab it later. But what I want to do is go into my practice trial list, and I want to make an entirely new procedure for this list object. So I'm going to go ahead and delete my procedure, and if you notice that it doesn't show up there anymore, and I'll just call this Trialproc and hit Enter. Now I have my Trialproc right there. So all I want to do is just drag and drop Trialproc so it's for every single one of my exemplars, and then go into Trialproc. Now I still need my fixation, still need my stimulus, still need my ITI, and I need that feedback that I have down there. Now instead of making all of those from scratch, I can just reference the same ones. So all I do is take my fixation object and I'll drag it from my trial list and put it into my Trialproc. And again, I'm still referencing that same fixation. It's still that same one-to-one mapping as before, but since this procedure is now its own procedure and is not trial list, I can make the procedure look however I want. So I'll take my fixation object from there, I'll take my stimulus object, and I'll take my ITI, and then I'll go ahead and take that feedback object from unreferenced and put it just between my stimulus and ITI. So now my Trialproc can include that feedback object, and it's not going to affect my critical procedure later. I'm going to go ahead and rename this one. Feedback display 1 is honestly descriptive enough, but I'll just put it as feedback and hit Enter. I'm going to double click on it to open its properties. These all look good. I'm going to scroll through the slide states quickly. So I have correct, incorrect, no response, which is never going to happen, and pending, which will also never happen. But these are exactly the way I want them to look. And if you notice here, I have @RT and @ACC.mean. These are feedback-specific shortcuts that will get me to specific properties and will display specific properties about the object that I tell it I'm responding to. And I can tell it to respond to a specific object by clicking on this properties page button here and checking out this input object name property. Now this input object name property is basically like saying, hey, what object am I getting feedback from? Or am I giving feedback from? And in this case, it's going to be the stimulus object, which is honestly really one of the only objects with an input mask at this point. So I'll click apply and OK. And as long as I like the duration of this object, it's at 1,500 milliseconds. I honestly think that's fine. In data logging, I can set that just to time audit only because it doesn't really matter how they interact with the feedback. But keep that the same and I should be good. I don't really want them responding to the feedback object. So I had mentioned earlier, so now that we have all of this set up, I have my practice trials and I have my critical trials. If I run my experiment like this, what it's going to do is it's actually going to run through all 8 of my practice trials, and then it's just going to jump right into the critical trials. And I don't necessarily want that because there's no breaking point. There's nothing that says, okay, the practice trials are over, now we're going to move on to the critical trials. So the participant is just going to think that, okay, the practice trials just don't have feedback now. So what we want to do is we want to actually add a text display that happens after the critical or the practice trials and before the critical trials. And this is actually going to just say, hey, thanks for the practice. We're going to do the critical trials now. Now, where I could put it, I can actually put it in a couple of places. So I need it to happen after my practice trials and before my critical trials. So what I can do is I can click on this Proc block Proc. Now, if you notice here, it's pretty empty because everything else is on a procedure beneath it. I could put it right here in a text display object just after my practice trial list. So ePrime is going to process all of the practice trial list, and then it'll move on to the little text display object here that I have that says, hey, practice is over. I could also go into my block proc and do the exact opposite. I could take my text display object and put it just before my critical trials. It doesn't really matter where you put it. It's entirely up to you. I think it makes most sense to me coming after the practice trials, just because spatially the practice trials are over and I don't really want it to bleed into the block proc, which is the critical trials. So I'm just going to put it here, but that's entirely up to you. I'm going to rename this one just to end prac. And then double click on it to open it in the workspace. And then this is just going to be a very simple message to participants. Just thank you very much for completing the practice trials. Now we will begin the critical trials. Oops. There we go. The critical trials will not include feedback. Press space to begin. There we go. So then I'm going to go ahead and click on the properties page there, click on the duration input tab, and again, I just want these to be on the screen for as long as the participant needs to process this information. So I'm going to change my data logging to standard, duration infinite. I'm going to add a keyboard input mask and change my allowable to space. And hit apply and OK. All right, so that's all I need to do for that. It looks like my experiment's coming together. The only thing I need is just a goodbye text display object. So what I'm going to do is double click on session proc here. I'm going to take a text display object and put it just after my block list here. And I'm going to rename this one just to goodbye and hit enter. And this is just going to be some very simple goodbye text. So thank you very much for your participation. Please let the researcher know you are finished. And then this one can just be on screen for the default amount of time. So my duration will be 1000 milliseconds. I'll change my data logging to time audit only and click apply and OK. And that's all I need to do. That is all I need to do to set up a cross modal priming task. Yeah, it's a pretty easy experiment to make. It's pretty similar to our priming task that we already make. The only difference there is where that priming is going to happen and how many types of stimuli you're getting at the same time. So in this case, you have that visual portion of it. You also have the auditory portion of it as well. So I'm going to go ahead and save the experiment. And that's all I have for you guys today. It was a pretty quick and easy experiment, so a rather short live stream today. If you guys have any questions, please feel free to leave a comment on the YouTube video. If there's anything that you would like to see, even if there are any tweaks to this experiment, you go, oh great, you have sound and an image, but maybe my task includes these types of things. I'd be happy to make a follow-up video. If you guys have a paradigm that you guys would like to see us make, I'd be happy to see that. Do note that any of these paradigms that I'm making in here are also going to show up in our experiment library. So if you happen to be perusing YouTube and you're like, oh great, they made a cross modal priming task, or they made a game of dice task, I wonder where I can get that file. If you just go to support.pstnet.com, sign in by clicking the sign in button in the top right hand corner, you'll notice a new part that'll appear on the login page that'll say experiment library, and each and every one of these experiments now lives in the experiment library, as do these videos, and you might actually be watching through that portal too, so you might not need this warning anyway. But just know that we do finish whenever I finish these, I do then immediately put them up on the experiment library, or in the experiment library, so you then get this exact version of the task, which even if yours doesn't need to look exactly like this, is going to be a great starting point for you guys, and it's something that we as a company want to keep doing. So if you guys have any paradigms that you really want to see as a sample, or you find that you're using all the time, please let me know. I'm always happy to help and happy to include these. If you have any specific questions about your experiment, please feel free to go to support.pstnet.com. That's our product, service, and support site. You can ask us questions on there. We're always happy to answer those. And if you really liked the video today, feel free to give us a like or subscribe to the page. It definitely always helps us out. So that is all I have for you guys today. Please have a great day, and thank you very much for watching.